r/ask Reddit. What sounds like fiction but is actually a real historical event. A Chinese emperor once ran in circles around a pillar to escape an assassin. He survived. I'm hearing yakety sax in my head, and the picture is beautiful. And it's a time lapse. That wasn't just a Chinese emperor, that was Qin Shi Huang, before he united China and became the first emperor in all its history. Some guy in Australia decided he wanted to hunt rabbits, but rabbits don't live in Australia, so then he released like 12 in his backyard and now there's a duck ton of rabbits in Australia. The Glasgow ice cream war. 6 people died in a turf war over ice cream van routes. They were dealing heroin out of the vans. I love my city so much. As the plane lands in Glasgow, passengers are reminded to set their watches back 25 years. Frankie Boyle. The difference between Edinburgh and Glasgow is that if you see a man with a golf club in Edinburgh, he is going to play golf. In 2007, a paraglider got trapped in the updraft of 2 joining thunderstorms and lifted to an altitude of 10 kilometers. She landed 3.5 hours later about 60 kilometers north of her starting position, having survived extreme cold, lightning and lack of oxygen. Imagine how ducking scary that would be. She doesn't remember much of it since she became unconscious quite quickly. If I recall correctly, she regained consciousness when she was back down at 3,500 meters. Imagine how ducking scary that would be. For real, imagine waking up 2 miles up in the air. Imagine that moment where you're getting dragged upwards through a thunderhead with lightning flashing and rain everywhere, loud as duck thunder as well, and then you just wake up 2 seconds later slowly descending back down. Holy duck. Remember how thin the air is at the top of Mt. Everest. Then realize this lady went substantially higher. How the duck did she survive? If you collapse on Everest, you stay there. She was lucky enough to fall back down again as there was no mountain in the way. In the 1800s there were street vendors in Egypt who sold ancient Egyptian mummies. Just lined them up on a street corner and sold them like they were umbrellas on a rainy day. English tourists would buy them to display as oddities. A town in France nearly danced itself to death in 1518 because of a dancing plague. My first genuine what in this thread. That's ducking wild. Why has this not been tapped into for fiction stories? I want to read a post-apocalypse story from the perspective of a survivor of the global dancing plague. Imagine infected people not coughing or getting any flu-like symptoms, but instead looking elated, full of energy, happy, and then dancing with the other infected until they fall down dead, still smiling and twitching while others dance on. Name the disease. And the book. Foxtrot. Stephen King. Come on, I know you got this in you. That plague wasn't even an isolated incident. The longest piano piece of any kind is Vexations by Erik Satie. It consists of a 180-note composition which, on the composer's orders, must be repeated 840 times so that the whole performance is 18 hours 40 minutes. Its first reported public performance in September 1963, in the Pocket Theatre, New York City, required a relay team of 10 pianists. The New York Times critic fell asleep at 4 a.m., and the audience dwindled to 6 masochists. At the conclusion, one sadomasochist shouted, "Encore!" Jack, a baboon who was employed to change rail signals. After initial skepticism, the railway decided to officially employ Jack once his job competency was verified. The baboon was paid 20 cents a day and a half bottle of beer each week. It is widely reported that in his 9 years of employment with the railroad, Jack never made a mistake. I wonder what that salary negotiation was like. Right? Like, how did they figure to just give him half a bottle of beer rather than a full or a quarter of a bottle? Maybe the guy tasked with giving him the bottle of beer decided he wanted to drink the first half? Return of Napoleon. An army was sent to intercept him, and they ended up fighting for him. If it was shown in a movie, most people would have considered it cheesy and unrealistic. The rise and fall of Alexander the Great. Never lost a battle in his life, conquered the whole known world, and only stopped because his soldiers were tired. And then died of the flu when he was like 32. Honestly, his life should be a vaccine commercial. No matter how great you are, vaccines will save your life. The entire Taiping Rebellion, a war started by a Chinese peasant who dreamed, and believed, He was Jesus' younger brother. Although poor, the first thing he did was have a giant demon-slaying sword forged, took over a city, asked the British why they wouldn't pay him tribute as the new head of their faith, engaged in total war with the Qing, applied pseudo-communist policies like abolishing private property, separated women and men from ever interacting, and sent the women to the front lines. Over 20 million people died, with some estimates as high as 40 million. It was the fourth deadliest conflict in human history. It killed more people than World War I. Only World War II, transition of the Ming, and Qing conquest of the Ming were deadlier. China's in another league when it comes to wholesale slaughter. Wholesale yen, Alibaba Express massacre. During World War I, the Germans sent Lenin back to Russia in a sealed train, calling him the most dangerous weapon that they had. Serial killer Karl Panzram broke into the home of former President William H. Taft and stole jewelry, bonds, and a gun. With the money he got from the first two, he bought a yacht in which he used the gun to kill a bunch of sailors. The story of the Great Boston Molasses Flood sounds like it would be right at home in scene in a bad Adam Sandler flick. I've said it once, I'll say it again, it should be the Boston Massacre. Apparently you can still sometimes smell it. The fire in Dublin, Ireland on the 18th of June, 1875. A fire broke out and spread to a malt house, and the heat broke open every alcohol barrel and flooded the streets with it. The people of Dublin decides to drink the burning alcohol that is spreading in the streets, filled with litter and debris, and was literally on fire. 13 people died not from the fire or smoke but from alcohol poisoning they got from drinking the street whiskey. The Second Punic War has all the makings of a great story. It has a blood oath, an underdog story, bravery, an OP main character, tragedy, and a final showdown between the two main characters. The fact that it all, or most of it, happened blows my mind. There could be a godlike series about the three wars. Trying to move some elephants over a couple of mountain ranges. In 496 BC, the army of King Gao of Yu put 3 ranks of criminals in the front of their battle formation. Their task was to impress the enemy with their ferocity and commitment by chopping off their own heads as soon as battle was joined. The tactic was a success. While their opponents from the state of Wu were recovering from their astonishment, they were overrun by the rest of the Yu army. The convicts, who were condemned men anyway, had been coerced by the threat that if they didn't comply with this plan their families would be executed also. Stephen Fry on QI. I think cutting off one's own head is pretty unlikely, but they might have slit their own throats. True, but whatever method the convicts were forced to use, and considering that the opponents likely had no idea that they were condemned criminals, that's got to be one of the most effective direct acts of psychological warfare of all time. Note, by direct I mean one that's targeted at a specific local audience with immediate effects, as opposed to psychological warfare tactics that operate with a wider range and time frame, like lowering the morale of a whole city or country as word of the event spreads, or confusing misdirecting a whole military force. Vesna Vulovic fell from a height of 10,160 meters and lived. She holds the world record for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. Anything more than 450 meters and you might as well go for the record. Google's terminal velocity. Yup, checks out. A typical skydiver in a spread eagle position will reach terminal velocity after about 12 seconds, during which time he will have fallen around 450 meters, 1,500 featuring. I'm still going to want to aim for the pillow factory. Granted, you hit the roof and immediately die. There are also, if I recall correctly, only 7 known people to have survived with no chute over 5,000 meters. The Japanese kamikaze, Divine Wind, that saved the country from an amphibious invasion by the Mongolian hordes. The Mongols captured a foothold on some outlying Japanese islands and started to attack the mainland. The Japanese army pushed them back, and they had to retreat to China. When they did, a typhoon ravaged their navy and sank their ships. The Mongolians, probably reasonably, seeing this as a fluke, decided to rebuild and attack again. 7 years later, unfortunately for them, the Japanese fortified their coastline, after basically months of sailing around seeking a place to land. Another typhoon struck their fleet and destroyed them. There would be no third invasion. Then they had some fun fighting for a bit before they died in a tornado. Bill Wirtz. During World War I, Christmas 1914, the British and German forces on the Western Front unofficially made a ceasefire without the authorization of their superiors in order to celebrate, trade goods, and play football. Also during World War I, the Russian and German armies in Poland stopped fighting each other in order to fight off an enormous pack of wolves that had been attacking both armies. Both of these sound like something you'd come across in a novel and irreparably break your suspension of disbelief. In 1967, Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt simply vanished without a trace and no one knew what happened for 40 years. Ted Bundy escaped from custody twice, the first by jumping out of a 3-story building, second time by taking a guard's outfit and walking out the front door. The second time was after he broke the light fixture in his cell and crawled into the officer's apartment above. A tornado helped the US in the War of 1812 during the Battle of DC. A freak patch of dense fog saved the colonies during the Revolutionary War. Similarly, hurricane saves Japan from being invaded by the Mongols twice. Hence kamikaze, divine wind. And then everybody gave Japan shit for believing they were the chosen people protected by the gods. If the ocean killed all my enemies for me twice in a row, then I might be inclined to believe that. 2. The many defenestrations of Prague. Starting a war by throwing diplomats out the window is almost straight out of 300. I am glad that the outside world remembers : Paddy Roy Bates, the founding king of Zealand, had his country, a small naval platform, invaded and his son Michael taken hostage by Dutch and German mercenaries. They came in riding jet skis, speedboats, and helicopters while he was in England buying groceries. He hired a helicopter, came down a rope with a shotgun, reconquered Zealand and took the mercenaries hostage. An official German diplomat was sent to negotiate the release of the ringleader. This sounds like a fun Steven Seagal movie. The Emu War, when Australia went to war with emus. Not only that, but they lost to birds. Patton in World War II in charge of a decoy blow-up army division. Like that story that the Germans made an army base out of cardboard to try to fool the British that they had more tanks and stuff than they really did. So the British dropped a cardboard bomb on it. In fact, loads of the British intelligence counterintelligence operations in World War II were amazing stories. In 1504, a German imperial knight lost his hand to a cannon shot which forced his sword against him. He lived. Pretty amazing for that time. And instead of, stopping with fighting and living the rest of his life in peace, he had an iron hand forged, some Jaime Lannister shit. Let me repeat that. This mother ducker had an iron hand prosthetic over 500 years ago. He continued fighting for 40 years, after which he chilled in the castle of Hornburg for his final years. His name was Godso the Iron Hand, and the hand itself is still at display. The last time Liechtenstein went to war was the Austro-Prussian War. The fact that sounds like fiction is that they were forced to send 80 soldiers, and came back with 81. They made a friend in the form of an Austrian liaison officer. They also apparently rent out the country for events. When King Edward I was young, before he was king, he was a prisoner of Simon de Montfort during a civil war. During his captivity he asked to ride the horses at the castle where he was being held. He proceeded to ride them one by one, tiring them all out. When it came to the last horse he mounted, bade his captors farewell and rode away. All of the other horses were too tired to give effective chase. I guess the story of Desmond Dawson, the one American soldier who jumped in Normandy 3 times, got captured, escaped, captured again, escaped again, started fighting in the Russian army, liberated the POW camp where he used to be held captive, and then got home and got married in the same church where he had his funeral. His dog tags were found on a German spy trying to infiltrate the American lines, but got caught and so they assumed he was dead. Sort of related. Apparently, when Ron Howard had preview screenings of Apollo 13, on at least a couple comment cards were remarks about how the ending was so fake as to be unbelievable, as there was no way those astronauts were surviving that ordeal. There was that time Austrian hussars got some schnapps on their way to attack the Ottomans, got drunk, and fought their own infantry over access to the schnapps. In the multilingual confusion someone shouted, "The Turks." which caused widespread panic and a full retreat by both the cavalry and infantry. Officers shouting halt in German sounded to their non-Austrian allies like they were shouting Allah, which only deepened the confusion. As they retreated into the rest of the Austrian army, those commanders also thought it was a Turkish attack and ordered artillery to fire into the oncoming men. That was the story of the Austrians routing their own army because of Schnapps, known as the Battle of Kerensebes. According to Wikipedia, there are estimates of 1,200 casualties. 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.